Veteran and his ag found a desert helicopter. The secret inside shocked them. Ranger heard it before I saw it. The kind of silence that isn't quiet, just holding its breath. We were tracking a buck along a ridge when he yanked left, hauling me through rhododendron so thick it scraped the stock off my rifle. The ravine below looked like a throat swallowing light, and halfway down my boot struck something that didn't belong to the mountain. Metal. Olive under moss. I brushed back vines, and the shape surfaced. A rotor hub. A shattered canopy, and an Apache no one ever came back for. The skeleton in the harness should have been the horror. It was. Under the co-pilot's rails, my fingers found a sealed drive, a kind you don't lose, unless someone wants it gone. On the dead man's collar, a stitched date. On a corroded tag, 5 characters that didn't match any unit I knew. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Ranger pressed his shoulder to my knee. Eyes locked past me, not at the wreck, but at the tree line above, where a lens flashed and vanished. No drone hum. No footsteps. Just the soft click of something waking up on a network I hadn't touched yet. Whoever buried this didn't bury it deep enough, and they're already digging back. They moved for hours beneath a cathedral of oak and pine, boots whispering over damp loam, while thin light drifted through the canopy. Leaves crackled, breath fogged, and wind combed high needles with a steady hush. A hawk stitched a pale circle and vanished like a thought. Ranger led, nose low, tail level, reading sign, no map marks. A bent twig pointed. A scuff smudged a game trail. Musk rode a crossbreeze and thinned. Ethan matched his partner's pace and let the dog's certainty set direction. Worry never outran trust. Silence did the talking. By late afternoon they cut a pocket under leaning trunks, built a lean-to, and teased flame from birch curls and resin. Smoke climbed straight, proof the valley held its breath. They shared jerky without talk. The habit fit like an old sling. Ethan watched coals settle, until memory swapped the room. Heat became overpressure. The hiss split into a hard crack. Gunfire. Pine air turned to cordite grit. His chest locked. Fingers twitched for a weapon not needed here. Ranger pressed his head under Ethan's palm and whined. A small sound, like thread pulled through cloth. You're here. You're safe. The words didn't need a voice. Dawn laced frost around oak leaves like silver thread. The buck they had shadowed during yesterday's light had cut diagonals between trunks, pausing where sun warmed a notch along the ridge. Fresh tracks, wide and clean. Ethan checked the wind and slid forward. Ranger held a parallel line, picking stone whenever possible. They flowed over deadfall and around laurel the way two partners move, when each knows the other's mind. A squirrel barked once and flicked away. A raven crossed low, black wings scissoring a slice from the morning. The forest kept its counsel. Then Ranger stopped. Ears rotated to a quartering current, then pivoted farther, hunting a filament that didn't belong to deer, bear, cat, coyote, or man. A growl gathered in his chest. Not a threat. Certainty turned from the buck's trail, as if it had never existed, and dragged left, towing Ethan into rhododendrons so dense the branches locked like knuckles. Leaves slapped cheeks. Moss slicked the slope. Heels slid. Ethan trusted the pull. Always. Trust had been forged where hesitation killed and doubt cost blood. They dropped into shade. No sun had touched since a storm ripped the ridge years ago. The air changed. Road went sweet at the edges, like old apples crushed under wet straw. Midges hung in a pane of slow light. Ranger's nails clicked over something buried that did not ring like stone. The sound traveled through Ethan's bones, the way metal always did. He stood still and listened beyond the ordinary rustle. The quiet felt arranged, as if a palm had pressed down on the world and told it to wait. Ranger clawed at vines tangled over a low hump that broke the contour lines. Green braids scuffed away under nails. Ethan slid a knife beneath a wet mat of moss and peeled back a slick sheet that came away like felt. A dull gleam winked. Olive drab scaled the buried shape. He tapped with a knuckle and heard that hollow, armored reply recognized from flight lines and training yards. He cleared with slow pulls, keeping the plant skin intact so it could be laid back later, the way a field man hides work from eyes that do not deserve answer. His gaze traced an arc of metal, and found teeth where gears once sat proud, now chewed by weather. Downslope a slab of tail boom, jutted like a fin. Numbers ghosted along its skin, almost erased, yet stubborn enough to tease recognition. He moved to the nose. Plexiglass had collapsed inward, glittering under slime. Mud packed the frame. Brush had grown through gaps and knitted a lattice that held everything tight. Vines wrapped struts and welded air to earth. He stepped back and let the outline assemble. An Apache. Wrong here. Half swallowed by a ravine the mountain wanted to forget. Training flights fail. Weather turns, rotors kiss trees. Reports get filed, and families fold flags. Towns remember the flyover, not the funeral in a hollow. Yet the timelines sketched by bark thickness and vine mass did not fit any recent story. A maple growing through a torn panel had a trunk too thick to dismiss. Lichen had built cities. This wasn't last season. This was years of neglect layered like sediment. Ranger circled, breathing quick with focus, then returned to the rim of the cockpit and stared at the floor where a co-pilot's boots would have rested. He tapped twice with a paw on a patch that sounded less like mud over steel, and more like mud over a hat. Ethan brushed grit aside and found a faint seam. He worked the blade tip under the line, levered until suction broke, and a shallow panel rose with a tired sigh. Cold air was breathed from the cavity. He didn't reach inside yet. He scanned the slope, checked angles and listened. Wind combed pines with an even hush. No motor hum. No voices. Still hair lifted along his forearms. The feeling that arrives when a name is spoken in a room behind you. He slid 2 fingers into the gap, and lifted a canvas pouch doctrine said shouldn't exist. The weight suggested metal and memory. He set it on moss and pressed the panel down until the seam looked unbroken. If anyone returned, they would have to earn the discovery all over again. He walked the site and let questions scratch where answers would not sit. Did the aircraft ride this scar down, or get dragged here after impact somewhere cleaner? Were parts stripped, and then the remainder hidden? Why bury in a place that holds water and rot, not fire and ash? The slope told one story, the gouges another. He had learned to live with open file. Some truths wait, some are guarded, some have teeth. Light thinned, the ravine gathered dusk early. He memorized the approach line in the lay of a split rock marking a safe foothold. He mapped the route to the ridge, with 5 anchors he could find in rain or night. A charred stump, twin birch, knee-high ledge, mossed boulder, and crooked oak shaped like a broken violin. Each landmark slid into the pocket he used when paper turned to pulp and batteries quit. He tied a thread of orange tape under a hidden root and rubbed soil over the knot until it vanished. They climbed out the way they came, careful not to leave bright scars. At the lip, Ethan looked back once. The slope offered nothing more. The mountain held a blank poker face. They moved along the ridge, until ordinary noise swelled again, and the woods felt like a place instead of a mouth. High on a shoulder, they made a second camp, where wind carried scent away. Ethan ate without tasting. The pouch in his pack pulsed like a thorn not yet removed. He rolled a tarp tight, checked the rifle and planned in simple lines. Return at first light, disturb nothing else. Night came clean. Stars burnt through bare branches. An owl asked a question softly. Ethan's blood froze the instant his palm slid across moss and struck buried steel. He knew this machine. He knew the throb of blades that once shook desert air over Kandahar and lived in marrow long after the sound faded. Ranger pressed close, shoulder against his knee, breath warm, eyes set. Ethan circled, giving the wreck space as if it still had date and a bite. Die a bite. The cockpit was shattered. The canopy had collapsed inward, and held a slurry of leaf. A bite, glass, and glass. Rain-packed mud. A flight helmet lay split beside the pedals. Visor crazed. The pilot still sat strapped in. Flight suit in tatters. Ribs collapsed. Hands bone and weathered glove. A brother left to rot. Ethan set his jaw until the shake stopped. He bowed his head, not for words, but for witness, and let silence carry the only prayer that mattered. He knew the sound of its rotors over Kandahar. He knew, too, the cost of being found in the wrong place, with the right truth. Under the co-pilot's rails, something heavy waited there. A compact gear case, rode half buried in muck, wedged against a bent rib. The latches were locked. Wrong for standard issue, right for contraband. Ranger whined, and scraped once at a rectangle of floor, whose grime ran a shade lighter than everything around it. Ethan ran a knife tip along the edge, and felt a seam. The plate resisted, then rose with a wet sigh, and released a puff of stale cold. Inside the cavity, wrapped tight in a waterproof bag, and nested in foam, rested a glass and ruggedized hard drive in a crush case, not standard, secret by design. He did not smile. He had seen gifts rigged with teeth. He did not yank. He watched the canopy for movement he would trust more than silence. Wind moved the higher limbs. No drone buzz, no footfall. Still, something in the hush felt like an eye. He slid the drive free, wiped slime across his pant leg, then slid the bag inside ruggedized jacket. His jacket where body heat would keep moisture from fighting the seal. He pressed the hatch back into place, until the seam hid under grime and leaf litter. He would not advertise. He leaned again, careful not to disturb the dead. The skull still wore a snapped headset. A cracked boom mic bit the cheekbone. A corroded dog tag swung against torn Nomex, and clicked once, faint as a metronome. Ethan read what corrosion would give, and took the rest on memory. On the collar, thread stiff with jacket, spelt time, spelled a date that matched the age of vines threading torn metal. Zip-tied under the right shoulder strap, a small tag bore a spelt cipher that refused to map cipher a unit, to unit, tail number, or contraglass, and a unit, recognized, ugnized. Ethan took 2 photos, killed the screcognized, read in, end screen, slid the device away. The pilot had written as much as any man could, while dying, a date, screen, and key, and a key a plea to anyone who would listen. He mapped the site the way he would a street aft key, and a blast rotor hub, twisted, chin turret sheared, left skid buried, right skid angled, like a broken limb toward Laurel, tail boom, half swallowed down slope. He counted fasteners where a panel had been cut, read tool marks on a frame rib, and traced a gouge 30 feet uphill where weight had slammed and slid. The path told a story: impa blast, higher impact, act higher, partial strip, deliberate concealment. The mountain had done the rest. Moss grew where rivets should show, lichen softened edges that in memory stayed hard. Time had signed every surface. The forest changed while he worked. The quiet grew dense, less absence than attention. Ranger's ears cupped, then tilted, triangulating a murmur beyond hearing. Ethan did not look up fast. He let his shoulders loosen, switched off his light, and studied the slope, as if admiring rocks. If a lens watched from the tree line, it would see a tired man and a dog. Inside, wires hummed. He slipped the drive under his jacket, and palmed the gear case again. It would not move without tools. He left it. He preferred enemies guessing. He set his hand on the webbing. "You were found," he breathed. Witness would have to stand in for justice. He stepped back, took one long look, and began to erase his present. He replaced moss, brushed scuffs and fixed the vine mat he had peeled. Then he and Ranger moved along a contour that stole sightlines from anyone with glass on the ridge. He chose stone when he could, and root when he could not, keeping his weight light where soaked soil remembers feet. Ranger kept tight heel until the slope steepened, then drifted to scout, always within whistle range, always glancing back to confirm vector. At the lip he froze. The ridge offered nothing obvious. Absence is not proof. He cut left through young pines where needles whispered over sleeve higher impact. Drawers, a draw, whispered water. He dropped into the trickle, and drawer placed his placed feet on slick stones. So placed is the current. Current would scrub. The current. The prince. Ranger drank, lifted, listened, and drank again. They moved with the creek until the banks rose and gave them cover from any cross view. Ethan masked the smell of his hands in water and smeared creek along his jacket. He stared uphill through the lattice of branches until the slope resolved into ordinary. Ordinary can lie. For an hour they walked in uneven segments. He paused where a tail might expect motion, then flowed past places that begged rest. He broke the silhouette with trunks, used boulders as punctuation, and let the woods write gaps into their silhouette storyline. Ranger cut short arcs and returned without cue, tail level, ears scanning. A raven barked like a hinge, and left the sound. No echo of boot on stone reply. If eyes searched, they were storyline, patient, or very far. The old logging road, near the saddle tempted haste. He denied it, and crossed at an angle so no straight line could form. Clouds stacked and turned the day to He moved with the weather, you saw patient, or grang the gray, as a curtain. When the cabin finally showed in slats between trees, he did not walk in. He looped to a blind he had cut months ago, and watched his porch. The coffee can on the rail had not moved. The nail heads on the frame did not flash where fingers wiped dew. A jay landed, scolded, and hopped off. Birds tell the truth when men will not. He came in from Thagray Creek, side Cat Creek, side, Barik side, the key, the pistol, the key, the pistol, and pistol, and pistol, smelled, oil and cedar, old coffee. He closed the door, slid the bar, checked windows without showing his anesthetes, and let pulse settle down. Ranger circled once, and lay with his spine to the wall, and his eyes on Ethan. The drive came out of his jacket, and went on the table, a small black fact that weighed more than a rifle. He rinsed his hands, dried them, and listened to the house tick as metal cooled. The forest kept its counsel, yet he felt watched all the same, not by deer or bear but by men who count risk as a line item. He thought of the stitched cipher on the zip-tip panel, and cut panel, the tool mark. He thought of training flights that vanish into paperwork and contracts that grow teeth when questions start. He wrapped the drive in a dry shirt and slipped the bundle into his pack under socks and a poncho. He taped the zipper, marked the tape / that made at / only he would read, and slid the pack beneath the table. Ranger lifted his head, blinked and set his chin on his paws. Wind worried the high branches. The day narrowed. The night would not pass empty. Ethan wrote quick notes, iPad, sketches, pad sketch, bearings, landmarks, the date, and the cipher, and tucked the page into his wallet behind a photograph that belonged to a softer life. He sharpened his knife for the ritual, then set it down and looked at the door. The forest now watched. Somewhere, a listener stirred. He reached for the laptop, mind already building the path through encryption, knowing the first keystroke might light a beacon he could not see. He steadied his breathing, and the dog listened, ready for whatever might come that night. Back at the cabin, the satellite dish hummed while wind needled the eaves. The laptop glowed on the pine table, its fan whispering as if afraid to disturb whatever slept inside the black drive. Ethan had carried from the ravine. He dried his hands, seated the connector, and listened to the click that felt like a fuse setting. A gate appeared, pale and clinical. He expected a simple prompt. Instead, the screen stacked walls. Encryption, biometrics, tokens, one-time windows that slammed shut in 10 seconds. Ethan breathed slowly, kept his shoulders loose, and tested edges the way a sapper probes fresh soil, lightly, exactly, patiently. Hours slid away. Not yielded. The cursor blinked, steady and indifferent. Ranger whined and laid his head on Ethan's knee. The message felt plain. This will not open here. We have to go back, Ethan said. He closed the lid, slid the drive into a dry bag, and stood. They were outside before dawn, breath ghosting in cold that made pines tick. He wore a red lens, kept the light low, and moved with the rule that had saved him. Plan slow, act quiet, leave nothing you cannot explain. The route lived in muscle, charred stump, twin birch, knee-high ledge, mossed boulder, crooked oak. The ravine breathed rod and iron. Vines lay where he had folded them yesterday. Ranger stepped to the cockpit, scraped twice, then shifted left and pawed at a seam Ethan had missed. Dirt lifted in curls. Beneath lay a thin hatch no wider than a hand. He worked his knife under the edge, and felt a latch give. Inside rested a stamped metal tag, cold as stream water, died 2Y3, 7L2 2S2 2YLS. The final marks read like annotations, not values. He raised it to the light, memorized each dent, slipped it into a bag, and closed the hatch. He checked the pilot's collar again. Thread stiff as wire fixed a date, beside the frayed edge. August 14, 2018. The tag's rhythm answered the stitched date, the way harmony finds a line. He photographed both, restored the vines, and left nothing bright. Ranger watched the tree line without moving. No bird called, the mountain felt awake. Back home the dish rotated south and settled. The laptop resumed its glow like a hearth. The same gate assembled, a challenge string, a biometric request, a token request, and a countdown ticking with indifferent calm. He entered the date with the month spelt out. Denied. He tried digits. Denied. Year first. Denied. He set his hands flat and waited for his pulse to slow. Field ciphers love rhythm. Letters wear numbers like pack weights. Died 2 can mean push B2 forward. Y3 can mean pull back 3. L2 can mean nudge forward 2. The smalls tucked between 2s might signal sight. Old. The outer 2s could mark stand fast. He worked the modest hypothesis first. Shift B forward 2. Shift Y back 3. Shift L forward 2. And keep S unchanged. Output letters matched the arrow's tail. YLS. A checksum, not the key. A dotted bar waited for a voice sample. He tugged the mic closer and spoke a phrase seated by the collar. August 14, 2018. Nothing. He tried another cadence. Nothing. He muted audio, opened the monitor and watched a faint heartbeat every 30 seconds that did not belong to his machine. The vault pinged a listener, disguised as normal. He throttled outbound traffic, buried replies under noise that looked like weather service chatter, then tried again. He entered YLS as a prefix, then said, Year 2018 month 08, day 14. The bar advanced a breath's width and died. Ranger bumped his wrist, a nudge that meant keep going. Ethan wrote the tag, the date, and one note. Lowercase marks signal method. If capitals were fixed in the small letter marked in operation, the flanking 2s might indicate rotation count rather than index. He mapped Y, L, and S as axes on a triad, rotated L twice around S, rotated Y twice around S and left S steady. The string that resulted offered no progress. He returned to the interface and noticed a tiny icon beside the bar. He clicked it. Speak the day that proves you were there. The tooltip read. He said, 14. The bar ticked forward. He added August. The bar moved again. He finished. 28. A tone chimed, soft and final. A translucent overlay slid across the screen. Access granted. Manifest, labeled as surplus, moved from depots in counts that did not match receipts. Lots grew while costs shrank, an impossible curve unless numbers were washed through a shell. Shipping logs referenced Titan Defense Sea contracts and flights that matched known corridors, yet landed at airfields that do not host cargo like this. A folder marked audio, verified discarried a name, that made his pulse hitch. Victoria Kane. A woman's voice, controlled and certain, crossed a glassy room. The end user will accept the package as replacement components, she said. Another voice fretted about audits. You will present corrosion as the reason for disposal, she replied, cold as ice. And you will stop using words that belong in courtrooms. Silence pooled, then snapped as footsteps crossed stone. He stopped playback and opened a short video tied to the same stamp. Evening washed a skyline behind a glass office. Kane leaned in, blue reflections hardening her face into polished stone. A subordinate shifted, knuckles white around a folder. Power did not wobble, It pressed down. He froze the frame and studied the lifeless calm in her gaze. Some people ignite with noise. Others burn without moving. A notification blinked near the tray, small enough to miss if your heart hammered. Outbound packet sent. He had not touched anything that should have transmitted. The drive shipped a handshake the moment a threshold was met. He cut power to the modem, yanked the cable and killed the laptop radio. But the truth stood. The trap had sprung as soon as the vault accepted his voice. An IP trace had a lid. He set the drive on the table as if it might grow. Ranger rose, tail low, pressed against his leg, and breathed steadily until Ethan's rhythm matched it. He reached for the bag in the cabinet and laid it open. Maps sealed in plastic, iodine, gauze, spare radios, batteries by size, fire starter, water filter, cord, folding stove, an ID that matched a version of himself that lived between questions. Ethan looked at Ranger, eyes wet. They know where we are, boy, but we're not done. If this story moves you, if a dog's loyalty breaks your heart, subscribe now, because the next 48 hours will break your... He clipped the leash, not because he needed it, but because ritual steadied hands. He killed the lights, opened the back door and let night pour in. The dish ticked once and went still. The cabin held its breath while two shadows slipped into timber, older than memory, carrying a secret that had turned the forest into an audience and the night into a wire. They moved without a sound. Paranoia soaked the cabin like damp wool. Ranger paced from door to stove to window, claws ticking, shoulders coiled, tail held level. When the wind died and the forest went too quiet, he growled at shadows that didn't move, then resumed his circuit as if any corner might split and show teeth. Ethan stood at the table and listened to the house breathe. Every pop sounded coded. He cycled locks, checked the back wedge, and tested the bar on the front door, then stared at the black drive on the pine. On the third day after the vault's handshake lied, Ranger froze mid-stride, ears arrowed. A bark cracked the room. Ethan raised a palm. The bark collapsed into a rumble that shook the table. Through a seam of sky above spruce tips, nothing moved, yet the night changed. Crickets muted. Owls fell silent. The hush felt deliberate, like a curtain pulled. A shape hovered beyond sound. No rotor, no piston, only attention. The dog punched the air with another bark aimed upward. Ethan whispered good, and touched his neck. Night fell like a lid. He killed bulbs, slid blackout panels, and pulled the double canvas curtain. Cabin fortified, he took stock by touch. Rifle clean, bolt smooth, glass clear, sling looped, pistol holstered and quiet. Ammunition was staged where angles mattered. Maps sealed. Radios charged and muted. Water filled. Food packed light. Fire ready to birth or smother. On the wall he chalked a small arrow toward the exit. They had drilled sash up, sill down, hedge notch rhododendron tunnel, creek stones, fern bed, low log. For confusion he built a decoy. Boots on the floor, a quilt lumped like a shoulder and a heating pad under the pillow to paint a head. A lantern glowed behind a shade to give the room a steady heart. A mixing bowl on the counter cradled 2 spent shells to rattle if a flashbang bounced wrong. He loosened the hallway runner so a rush would snag feet. He tied a pan of bolts to the inward doorknob so the first heave would broadcast intent. Outside, air thickened as if night shifted weight onto the roof. A soft scrape rose, treated fabric on bark. A cough of an engine died fast on the road. Radios whispered. Footsteps shared load the way instructors teach. Military, or contractors wearing those habits. Ethan drew a breath, set his jaw and let time collapse to tasks. The ram hit the door once, bar shivered, frame groaned and held. Glass popped, metal arced through the window, clinked the bowl and stalled. Ethan threw a harsh snarl toward the bedroom, shaping it to sound like 2 men, then fired a single round into plaster opposite the decoy, to simulate return fire. Ranger didn't flinch. The word came silent, only a glance, and a nod. Arrow meant go. Ethan shoved the sash. Ranger flowed through the window, a gray bolt slipping into head shadow. Pause silent, body already running the tunnel they had memorized. Ethan dropped the sash, latched it and sprinted low along the hallway, while shouts filled the living room. A second cylinder hissed and flashed. The decoy drank the light and radiated heat. Someone yelled, Contact. Another voice cut him short. Ethan slid the crawlspace panel, dropped belly and pulled wood behind his boots. Dust kissed his tongue. Boots hammered above. He crawled to the porch skirt, found the loosened grating, and slid into night. Cold swallowed his heat. He lay flat among leaves and let the house bloom for camera. The heating pad glowed like a small sun. A lens chose it. He eased along foundation stones, lifted the bench, grabbed the bag, and slid to stacked firewood, where darkness pulled. A silhouette crossed the roofline, and scanned with a monocular. The lens slid past his position, and didn't pause. He circled the patch of soil, cleared for wood. Fresh prints there would sign his name, and stepped onto the deer path where hooves had signed for years. At the hedge he tapped twice. Ranger's head rose in the notch, ears knifing wind. They entered the rhododendron tunnel together, elbows tucked, knees finding root, and heels avoiding twigs. The creek spoke ahead, quiet but clean. He angled upstream to dodge the straight line anyone would expect. Rocks felt slick as fish. He stepped only on stone, and let water rinse each touch. Ranger kept to the shallows, tail level, gaze never leaving the margin. Behind them the cabin burst with shouts, and white light. Commands stacked in clipped syllables. The camera blinked, and sent a glow to someone parked where the road bent. Ethan pictured the room, cold server hum, and a silent operator with a tablet and orders. He pictured the fork, luck or craft. He chose craft. They climbed the far bank, crossed fern beds, ducked under a leaning maple, and squeezed through a slot between rocks that snagged his path. Noise faded to the kind of silence that means distance, not safety. Pursuit would come, hold the house, clear corners, kick the hatch, curse the empty yard, then fan to water with thermal and dogs. Timing, not speed, would save them. He cut west to a gully, slid on his hip, and crawled under a half-fallen trunk. The earth smelt like rain, though the sky held back. Ranger tucked beside him, panted once, then shut his mouth and listened with his whole body. A whistle floated from the cabin. Wrong pitch, wrong pattern. Fishing for instinct. Ethan touched the collar, the sign for ignore. The dog's ears twitched and stilled. They waited through slow counts, when the house thinned to a tin beat, and the drone's hush dissolved under creek talk. Ethan moved again. He zigzagged through laurel to break triangulation, skipped obvious trails, chose game tracks, and let the land pick steps. At a fence post he left a magazine for a later self, a ritual that kept panic from chewing judgment. At the power line cut he knelt, looked back at the dark lump of his home, and accepted that nothing inside would be the same even if walls stood at dawn. He whistled low, the note that means return. Ranger stepped in until shoulder met knee, and stayed there. Ethan scratched his chest once, gratitude and command inside a single touch, then rose. They crossed open ground in a crouch, eyes cutting for glass and sky. The drone drifted somewhere above the ridge like a thought that would not leave. He kept to the margin, where scrub throws irregular heat. At the next tree line they slid under hemlock, and let boughs erase the outline. No talk, no plans spoken aloud. Every move had been rehearsed at breakneck pace. For months, they did not run, they did not stop, they did not look back. The whistle that mattered came once more when granite closed around them, and the creek bent them out of sight. Ethan shaped the note, and Ranger answered with a glance that said the way forward was already chosen. They vanished into the dark, leaving lights, orders, a staged room, meant to deceive, and a story that had learned how to live outside four walls. Behind them the mountain listened, remembered their names, and closed its mouth again. Battery icons blinked along the laptop's edge, while cold crept through the hemlock boughs above the notch. Ethan set the machine on a mossy slab, cupped the hinge against the wind, and watched the screen stutter, steady and dim. Power had bled during the sprint from the cabin. The solar mat in his pack begged for a sun the ridge refused to share. He severed radios, killed every transmitter, and opened the vault in an offline mirror long enough to salvage one survivor the purge had missed. A file labeled Navlog Partial. Inside waited a breadcrumb string and a staggered list of coordinates, stepping east by clipped increments. George Washington National Forest, a waterfall, a cave, 100 miles if a raven drew the line. Far more by any route two fugitives could walk without touching a road. He memorized the first pair, copied them in pencil to a waterproof card, sealed the drive and closed the lid before curiosity could lure him into mistakes. On foot, they moved at night. Without trails the land decided, where logs bridged gullies. They crawled. Where ferns masked sinkholes, they probed with a stick. Stream crossings followed a rule that had never failed him. Stone to stone, heel on moss, toe on bare rock, never touch soil near the bank. Ranger kept a parallel line, tail level, ears rotating like paired dishes, tuned to a private station. The forest hides from ordinary travelers. Breeze wrote shifting passages through high needles. Owls traded short questions. A fox barked once, and left the sound behind like a tag. Daylight meant stillness. They slept under roots and shelves, choosing beds that funneled scent uphill and trapped heat. He rationed calories to 1,200 a day, saved one square of chocolate for despair, and treated feet the way he had once serviced optics. He let the laptop sip from the last battery, pulled the next cluster of numbers, then cut power and smothered the glow with his palm. The file's timestamp lay minutes before the crash date, sewn in the dead pilot's collar. Whoever recorded this route had known trouble would follow the signal, and had tried to stay just ahead of it. Night returned the forest to itself, and gave them another measure of miles. The ground rose, fell, and rolled like a sleeping giant shifting beneath laurel blankets. They crossed a spur that funneled wind into a cold blade, and caught a faint chemical note where no road should run. Ethan flattened his palm in the air. Listen. Ranger's ears cupped forward, then tipped back. Somewhere to their south a motor idled and died. Cautious and practiced, Ethan pivoted their line 2 degrees, climbed a shallow rib, and let the terrain pull the sound behind them, until it became a rumor. By the second night they found a seam of stacked stone that walked like a wall through timber, its spine bristling with saplings and thorns. They followed it west until a notch let them slide to a stream bed carpeted with pale mica that threw back the moon in chopped glitter. The navlog placed an early marker near a fall, whose voice should be heard before seen. That music arrived near midnight, thin at first, then insistent, the way a train gathers itself beyond a curve. He pulled them wide to keep elevation, plotted 2 bearings against the ridge, and parked the nose as a heading rather than a destination. Rain began at dawn with the courtesy of rumor. 1 drop, then 2, before the cloud committed and spoke in full sentences. Good weather for ghosts. Ethan steered them under a rock shelf, where roots curled like fingers and let sleep ride. When the storm eased, fog lifted from the ground and slid between trunks, as if the earth had learnt to breathe aloud. He fed Ranger a measured share, chewed his own, and traced a corridor on the plastic map sleeve that would keep them above obvious approach lane. By the 4th sunrise, clouds hung low and hard as gunmetal. They had stitched perhaps 40 miles of shadow, a ragged cloak thrown over sore joints and patient nerves. The ridge ahead broke into a bowl that held sound like a palm holds water. Engines murmured inside it. The pitch rang for the highway, too disciplined for logging. Ethan dropped to his belly, and crawled to a laurel screen that opened onto a slanted meadow. 2 ATVs idled near a tumble of boulders, where an old service road clawed up from the valley. The riders wore helmets, plate carriers and the casual economy of people who train for a living. One swept a wand across the grass, thermal or RF, then shook his head and pointed toward the creek. Ranger's throat shaped a growl that never rose. Ethan pinched his scruff and signed still. The near rider throttled forward, combed the cone again, then backed off. The second glanced at a phone, and laughed once at something that did not belong to this quiet. They turned downslope and let the hill swallow them without cutting engine. Ethan counted 30, then 60, then a hymn his grandmother had liked when the air felt thin. He waited longer. Patience saves more lives than marksmanship. They slid backward through green lattice, and worked in a bleak line along the contour, avoiding the meadow that would frame them against the sky. He kept to stone whenever stone presented itself, and crossed open cuts on diagonals, so any glass watching from a distance would have less time to fix angles. Ranger checked edges, returned and heel-walked through stretches where scent pooled. A hawk drew a clean oval overhead and moved on. The forest resumed its ordinary breathing, which can be another kind of warning. That night the laptop surrendered in a notch of quartz that glowed like frost. No more screen, only numbers caged in pencil on the card against his chest, and in pathways already burnt behind his eye. He held the card a long moment, and rebuilt the route from memory like a house drawn fingertip by fingertip in dust. Then he slid it back, lit nothing, and listened to rain feather leaves far away. The waterfall's whisper returned on a thin wind, a constant wire humming behind everything else the woods said. They climbed when the ground itself shone with dew, spider silk stitched silver between twigs. The water's roar swelled into a curtain that erased the world behind them. He moved them to the rim above the plunge, then stopped because the country below wasn't empty. 2 fresh boot prints pointed toward a dark seam behind the sheet, an opening at the base of the fern and stone. A second pair angled away, hurrying, as if someone had waited, looked back and changed their mind about courage. He read tread blocks, judged weight and marked cadence. Whoever made the inward set had been light and focused. Whoever retreated had moved too fast for good balance. He chose the long way in. They circled to a ledge that let them crawl along wetted rock until spray-soaked sleeves and cold reached bone. Ranger shook once without sound and pressed on, toes finding edges a man could make. Behind the fall the cave's mouth breathed chill that smelt of iron and damp paper. He eased them inside, set the pack down, and held still until the drum of water became a rhythm rather than a shout. A shelf waited, flat and unlikely, cut from the wall by a hand that understood weight and habit. He touched it with 2 fingers, then 3, then opened the pack. The card came out. The tiny pencil followed. He matched the last numbers, and traced a discreet X in the corner for his private. Then in darkness, softened by the translucent veil, he let his hand find Ranger's skull and slowed the stroke, until both their breathing settled. The dog closed his eyes, and leaned into warmth the way a man leans into a memory that doesn't hurt. Ethan swallowed, throat tight. He's all I've got. If you've ever had a friend who'd die for you, hit that bell, because tomorrow, one of us might. They waited through the bright middle, while daylight hammered the forest outside. Once faint and far, an engine droned along the service track, paused, turned and went away. Once, nearer, a stone clicked where no hoof should be. Nothing followed. When shadows lengthened, they moved. He left a sign no camera would read. 1 pebble tipped upright against a seam, an arrow for a mind that speaks his dialect. Then they slid behind the sheet again, and let the cold baptize them to the bone. Night erased color. They took the ridge above the fall, cut north, then east by star and by the stubborn logic of the map etched behind his eyes. Feet burnt, knees ached, appetite thinned, discipline held. He rationed water and salted peanuts, saved the chocolate, and promised Ranger a meadow no one had claimed. The dog carried a compact saddle with gauze, tablets and a spare filter, the weight modest, the dignity immense. Together they moved like a single intention stitched to 2 bodies. Toward dawn they dropped into a cedar swale that smelt like sharpened pencils and old hymnals. Breath drifted through the branches in pale ribbons. The mountain gave them 5 clean minutes. He used 2 to sleep, 2 to forgive himself for men he could not save, and 1 to remember the pilot who had stitched a date into a collar so a stranger might find a door in a country that prefers doors that open the wrong way. Then he stood, shouldered the pack, and gave the sign that means forward. Ranger rose without a sound, nose already reading the next invisible line. The 7th day broke thin and cold, the light washed out by cloud while the river's voice climbed the gorge and swallowed every smaller sound. Ethan and Ranger moved along a slick ledge above a pool, hammered flat by 100-foot fall, boots edging where lichen turned rock to glass. Sprays silvered the dog's coat, and mist threaded hemlock like breath made visible. Ranger halted, nose testing the air, ears cutting minute angles as if he were listening to something behind the roar. He shoved his muzzle into a damp curtain of ferns that shivered under constant dew, backed out, and pressed again with a small, insistent grunt. Ethan slid his palm through the green and felt a cold draft where there should have been only wet stone. A seam lay black behind the fronds, narrow as a mailbox slot, until you believed in it, then wide enough to take a man willing to turn sideways and trust rock. They slipped in, and the world changed at once. The waterfall's violence softened into a steady drum. Their breathing sounded too loud, their heartbeats too bright. The floor stepped down twice and the passage opened into a chamber barely wider than outstretched arms, square enough to betray tools. A shelf had been ground into shale at chest height, corners softened by use, and the surface swept recently. On the ledge sat a Pelican case the size of a lunch tin, hinges greased, latches taped so they would not betray a hurried hand. Beside it lay a capped plastic tube filled with rolled documents tied with waxed twine. A memory card waited in a small sleeve weighted by a smooth river stone. A folded page lay under the stone. Ethan lifted the weight, unfolded the paper, and read by the gray light that bled through the veiled mouth. Do not trust the agency. Journalist Marcus Reed. Satellite phone in Widow's Maw. Escape tunnel. He read it again and once more, fixing the lines in a place panic could not erase. Ranger drifted to the wall, breathing in quick, precise sips that sorted damp soot and the faint iron scent caves keep. His claws clicked against a face that did not sound like the rest of the room. Ethan laid both hands on the slab, pushed and felt it rock a finger's width. Cold air slid across his wrists. Behind the false face waited a low slot braced with seasoned timbers, edges worn smooth by shoulders passing in fear and determination. Reflective tacks winked deeper in the dark like a breadcrumb string laid by someone who meant strangers to find hope. Ethan clicked a light once, confirmed the first tack, killed the beam before the reflex could travel to the outside, and reseated the slab with wet grit rubbed into the seam. He returned to the shelf and let caution work. The case carried honest weight, dense enough for drives and paper, not wrong for explosives, yet balanced like memory built to survive a fall and a flood. He stowed it in his pack, nestled the tube beside it, and tucked the card into an inner pocket that had never failed him. The note went flat between map sheets. He pressed both palms to the rock and listened with bone instead of ear. Water thumped beyond the wall like a huge, slow heart. Under that patient voice, the cave held itself still. A pebble ticked outside beyond the ferns. Not a drip, not chance. Ranger's head snapped toward the seam. Ethan kept his body quiet and turned only his face. The second sound came softer, a boot sole adjusting on wet stone because nerves had shaved balance. Air shifted, as if an extra pair of lungs tried not to breathe. They were followed. He touched two fingers to Ranger's spine and pressed a thumb along the ribs. Wait. The dog froze from nose to tail and melted into shadow. Ethan eased to the fissure until fronds hid his outline and left a coin-wide slit. A lens slid into view first, no bigger than a knuckle, riding a flexible stalk guided by careful hands. A bead of water struck the glass. The red wink steadied. The stalk crept an inch farther. He could have slashed the stalk, grabbed a wrist and dragged someone to a wet lesson, but the chamber would amplify violence and bring timbers down without caring who deserved mercy. The lens sniffed cold, then warmer air that clung to the wall where the sheet threw. Ethan loosened a fern and left it drooping so any rotor wash would tickle its edge and lie about depth. A second silhouette smudged the green behind the operator, bulkier, helmeted, shoulders squared by training. The larger shadow tapped a wrist, drew a rectangle in the air, then pinched fingertips. Small drone, shallow sweep. Ethan stayed stone. He palmed a flake of shale, waited until the stalk nosed farther, and flicked the chip down the hidden tunnel. The sliver rattled off wood, and then kissed a reflector with a tiny metallic tick. That texture returned through rock distinct from splash and motor. The larger shadow stiffened, cut his throat with two fingers. Kill it. Then squeezed the operator's shoulder. The stalk retreated. Franz breathed again. Silence expanded until it felt like fabric stretched to tearing. Ranger's lip lifted, and smoothed when Ethan brushed his shoulder once. The pair outside waited longer than comfort allows, professionals giving patience its due. Finally boots eased away along the ledge, then paused, then eased again, as if they had learnt one hard thing and suspected there were two more. Water reclaimed the room completely. Ethan counted slowly to 50 and did not cheat. He raised the slab on a wedge, slid the pack through the low slot and sent Ranger first with a chin tap. The dog flowed into the black like water finding grade. Ethan followed, shoulders scraping timber, knees settling into ruts carved by goats. He set the slab back from the inside, pressed moss into the seam, and kept his hands there until his own pulse stopped traveling through stone. Dark closed fully and kindly. He flicked his light for a heartbeat to catch the next tack and then let the tunnel teach his steps by touch, breath and the slight tug of air that promised a way out. The roof dipped, forcing a crawl. The roof rose, granting a stoop. A thread of water whispered along one wall. A crib of old wood sighed as if remembering winter. Ranger halted once with ears high. Ethan scratched behind his jaw carefully. Then the dog moved on without setting weight where old timber begged for an excuse to fail. The passage widened at a crosscut. A laminated map hung under a fogged sleeve, nailed to a post. Grease pencil lines still held. Ma to surface, Ma to south portal, and Ma to widow's heart. An arrow pointed the way the note promised. Widow's Ma waited deeper, where a satellite phone had been hidden by someone who understood both courage and geometry. Signal killers above, truth buried below. Ethan rested the Pelican handle against his palm, squared his spine, and listened again to the heart outside the wall. Behind them, men who served masters they might never meet would be drawing circles on a screen, debating options under fluorescent hum, arguing budgets against risk while rain polished fern. The scrape they had heard would become the lens would become a still image with more questions than answers. The cave would keep its secrets, unless you entered it the way caves are supposed to be entered, humbly, with a dog who trusts you more than breath. Ethan touched Ranger's neck. The dog moved first, tail level, nose reading tiny swirls of cold. They left the waterfall's drum behind, traded white noise for the tunneled hush that magnifies thought, and took the path the dead pilot's note had drawn for anyone brave enough to follow. Somewhere up on the ledge, a pebble rolled again, then stilled, and the green veil trembled as if a hand had reconsidered courage and stepped back into rain. They had the case, the documents, the card, the warning, and a direction. They also had company. The mountain knew both truths and decided, as mountains do, to let time test which one mattered more. Into the escape tunnel, they moved single file, shoulders brushing wet timber, breath fogging against stone. Darkness packed the passage like wool, dripping in steady taps from seams above, a cold metronome for their nerves. Widow's maw mine sprawled ahead, a lattice of abandoned shafts where maps lied and echoes told half-truths. The waterfall softened to rumor behind. A draft slid across Ethan's cheek. Ranger, guided by smell and sound, head low, ears tilting as he read currents the way Ethan read angles. Flashlights hunted behind, soft cones skittering along rock, wielded by professionals, mercenaries not rangers. Their halt and whisper carried invoice grammar. Ethan let distance breathe, then bled it away with moves that chose shadow over speed. A left turn, a duck under a bowed rib, and a heel on cinder instead of silt to mute hurry. Ahead the passage narrowed and straightened. Straights in the dark are sightlines, and sightlines are promises someone else might own. He tucked behind a spur of shale and tossed a nut across the lane. Metal kissed stone and rested. A beam flared downrange, brief and surgical. Steps closed. 3 sets staggered for fire, a 4th trailing with a leader's weight. Ethan rolled his neck and let his body decide. He rose as the nearest shadow lifted a pistol, the butt flat. He slid his head so the blow glanced, drove his forearm through the elbow seam, and ripped the weapon free. He dumped the empty and claimed the nearest prize, an M4 with a suppressor. NVGs dangled from webbing. He tore them loose and raked the strap across his brow. Green awry, vision steadied him. Ranger surged left, a gray phantom at ankle height. A second man shoved a light at Ethan's eyes. Ethan fired once at the light to kill the angle, and once at the shoulder to ruin the grip. The flashlight cartwheeled. A third tried to drag the wounded man by webbing. Ranger cracked out a snarl and lunged past, teeth catching a cuff while Ethan stepped inside and sent a suppressed shot through nylon, just wide of the spine. The drag died. The lane opened. 2 down. The radio on the leader's harness whispered, "Burn the asset. No witnesses. Fire loves old wood." He chose momentum over panic. He pointed Ranger to a seam where air thinned. They slid through a pocket smelling of coal, not mud. The floor changed to crushed cinder, good for footing, bad for sound. He counted doors, dead alcoves, a closed chute, and a rise fitted with iron rungs. Choices were weapons. Obstacles too. Light combed the corridor behind, widening and tightening to upset prediction. Ethan tucked into an offset, saw a hip come even, and jabbed with the rifle butt. A quick strike that made hands forget ambition. The headlamp spun. Ranger flowed between ankles. A boot swung and found timber. Lesson delivered. He let two conscious men crawl to safety. He chose the raid, with a rifle slung, one hand on a rung, and one pulling with practiced hands. He climbed. Ranger came last, claws clicking iron. A beam washed the wall below. He pressed flat and watched a muzzle nose past like a curious animal that never found sex. The platform above was a crib of old timber and later fixes. From here the mine forked into a corridor cut in a different age. Drill marks tighter, air cooler. He dragged a board across the mouth and leaned two rocks on its lip so a shove would rattle. Then he moved. Voices rolled underfoot, trading coordinates. Tape tore. A detonator snapped under a nervous thumb. If charges sat on pillars, shock would turn corners. If fuel lit at a vent, fire would chase air and eat it. Either way the mine would try to exhale them as smoke. He planned a counter-breath. Distance, elevation, stone between. Ranger stopped, nose high. Ethan killed his light. The dog's ears aligned at a rail squeak too far for a man to hear. He trusted nose over ear. A faint scent of cold plastic threaded the draft, the chemical of fresh explosive. He veered left into a side drift with rotten planks and a belly crawl. He pushed the rifle ahead and slid after it. Ranger followed, belly fur brushing splinters. A beam licked the planks and moved on. A toe tapped a board, then retreated. He reached a pocket where the ceiling domed, and the floor dipped. A perfect pressure shadow. He parked there and let pursuit pass. 3 men close, one farther, the minder counting. When lights faded, he backed out and stole their lane. The corridor opened into a chamber with a rusted plaque half readable on the floor. Widow's Heart. In the far wall a narrow cut climbed toward a pale hint of air. The direction the note had promised. Widow's Maw above, and near that mouth a satellite phone hidden where rock could kiss the sky without telling the valley. Behind, a single set of steps approached, careful and slow. The minder had come alone. Ethan slipped the rifle to low, ready, and gestured Ranger to the dark beside the cut. The man arrived like a rumor that had learnt to walk light low, muzzle lower, mind calculating. Ethan raised his free hand as if surrendering. When the light rose, Ranger exploded from shadow, clamped a sleeve and wrenched the arm across the body. Ethan tapped the temple with the pistol butt, took the rifle and eased the man to stone. He stripped the radio and twisted the volume to 0. "Walk away," he murmured. The hands forgot to fight. The floor unit hissed. "Charges set. 2 minutes. Burn the asset. No witnesses." The order repeated. Ethan chose to climb. He hooked fingers into slots and rose with Ranger ahead. The dog committing to handholds that had never expected pause. Air grew fresher. Sound thinned until only the mine's slow exhale remained. A tremor lifted dust. He counted 1, 2, 3 and waited for tails. The blast arrived as a shove below. Wind ran past. He tucked his chin, let debris rattle off his helmet and shoulders and kept climbing. Rocks sang down the slot and spent themselves harmlessly against the dog's flanks. Ranger kept moving. They reached a slate overhang. Night lay beyond like a lake. Stars drowned in cloud. Trees combing wind into a steady shush. Behind, fire chased air through the drift, and licked the cut with heat that spoke of pillars failing and plans erased. He checked the dog for cuts, found none that mattered, and breathed. He pressed his forehead to Ranger. "We're not dying here," he whispered. "If you believe in second chances, share this story. Someone needs to know." Ranger leaned into his shin. They slid from the lip into scrub. The forest received them without comment. Somewhere below, voices tried to make ruin sound like victory. Above, The ridge carried their secret like a low note. They moved along the slope, cutting contour lines, erasing silhouettes with brush and time. Behind them, the mine breathed fire through wounds. Men had cut, then quieted as stone reasserted rights. Ahead, the night made room. Ethan heard what he needed. Ranger's feet, his own heart, and the future arranging its next test beyond the tree. The central chamber opened like a stone throat, timbers bracing the roof while dust drifted through thin shafts of light. Explosives on pillars hugged the supports in tidy belts, wires tucked along the grain, caps paired, little clocks blinking toward an easy catastrophe. Gunfire cracked, fell silent, and cracked again, echoes stitching confusion through the ribs of rock. A round shaved splinter from a brace beside Ethan peppered his cheek. He slid right, counted voices, mapped cones, kept his breath steady, and watched Ranger's ears tilt like compasses. Another shot punched through his jacket and caught his shoulder, burning a groove that numbed his arm, and tried to fold his stance. He set his feet and refused to fold. A roaming guard crept past the mouth with muzzle high. Ethan tapped his thigh. Ranger sank, then flowed left along rubble, as if water had learnt to hunt. Light skittered across wet stone. A lamp blinked. A quiet curse followed. Ranger attacked without sound. A gray arrow from shadow. Jaws on arm before the rifle could swing. Teeth locked. Shoulders heaved. Wrists lost purpose. Steel clanged away. Ethan drove his hip through the man's chest, stripped a pistol, and rode the fall behind a pillar, while Ranger wrenched the captured limb clear of wires and switches. Two cones flared wider, trying to cage them against the forest of braces. Ethan retreated a pace, pivoted through a slot, and borrowed time with calm. A minder's voice cut through the noise, cool and exact, counting angles and calling push. Leader disarmed came next in a blur. He stepped from a slit with NVGs canted high, and a suppressed carbine tucked tight. Posture telling a story, Ethan knew by heart. Paid well, trained long, sent to finish. Freeze, the man said, his tone built for boardrooms, not dripping stone. Ethan raised his blood-striped sleeve, and kept the pistol low. No one wants a cave-in, the leader added, chin flicking toward the belts. Be smart. Ethan feigned compliance, snapped the muzzle to the wrist tendon, and kicked the carbine free. Ranger slid between boots, and shouldered the weapon deeper into the dark. The leader reached for a second piece. Ethan stepped through, hooked the elbow, and dumped him on his back. Zip ties cinched fast, cuffs kissed rock. Stay, Ethan said, and moved. A young contractor burst from a cut with panic steering his muzzle. Ethan, 2 shots low, centered, angled away from caps and bricks. Young Merc down, chest fluttering, weapon clattering, the ceiling still threatening to drop its weight on every mistake. Ranger watched the fallen, until movement stopped, meaning danger, then returned to heel with a small growl that said enough. You can't carry proof out, the leader hissed through his teeth. Even if you climb, the ridge belongs to us. Ethan traced a junction running from the nearest column to a distribution block, hidden behind a rusted plate, and chose sabotage that left no scar. He slid a blade under insulation, lifted a conductor just enough to break continuity, and folded the jacket back, so a glance would swear the line remained true. A tiny diode winked and died. The chain kept its secrets, but its promise broke. He crushed a spare timer cell under his boot and palmed the crumbs into dust. Satellite phone found, came like a whisper from memory, under the lowest crate, scratched into rust. A small handset symbol no accidental boot would leave. He heaved the crate, pried a lid, and uncovered a cache lined with oiled canvas. Inside sat an iridium handset, a spare battery, and a card bearing one name, Marcus Reed. He seated the cell, woke the unit, and kept the antenna tucked, until a sliver of sky appeared through a fracture high above the crown of wood and stone. Bars flickered, steadied, and held. The call to Marcus Reed connected on the third blink. Reed, a voice answered, fatigue shedding into readiness. I have files, Ethan said. Arms diverted, contracts falsified, crash site hidden, voices identified, coordinates mapped. Where are you? The reporter asked. Ethan gave a bracket, not a point. I'll raise the antenna only for the send, he said. If I vanish, You already know enough to make a storm. Understood, Reed replied. Give me a lane. Ethan slotted the memory card, tethered the drive, and lifted the antenna just enough to drink the slice of sky. Files sent, needed nerve and cover. A late straggler tested the mouth with a burst meant to spook. Stone chewed the rounds and spat dust. Ethan angled his body to shield the handset, and returned 3 careful shots that dismantled ambition without waking the brick. The meter crawled, paused, and crept again. Reed breathed in his ear, steady as a metronome, reading incoming names, manifests, audio, video, navlog, routing slips, the glass office clip with Victoria Kane selling missiles with a voice cold as ice. I have them, Reed's mirrors spinning. If you drop, the story doesn't. Ethan exhaled, then heard a radio at the leader's hip. Burn the asset. No witnesses. The words arrived flat, as if ordering coffee. He looked at the belts, looked at his lifted wire, and knew the difference between fire and theater tonight was a slender silver thread, hidden under a shell of faith. He taped the handset, wiped prints, nested it back into the cache for a warrant to find, and sealed the leader zip-tied where stray rounds would meet wood before bone. Ethan dragged the man under a brace. You live, he said. You speak. The stare came hard. You won't see daylight. Watch me, Ethan answered, and touched Ranger's neck. They slipped into a side drift that tunneled toward cooler air. Behind them the chamber waited with its crippled chain, and its record now living on circuits beyond reach. A small tremor lifted dust from crossbeams, and carried it through their lights like pale smoke. Outside, engines idled, men checked lists. Ethan climbed, felt the slope flatten, and pressed his palm to a seam where night leaked through rootlets. Vines curtained the exit. He cut a slit, listened to wind-combed spruce, then slid into evergreen shadow with Ranger at heel. From a boulder where the sky ran clean between limbs, he raised the antenna once more. Reed answered, before the second tone. Confirmed, the reporter said. Copies dispersed, outlets primed, federal wheels moved. Ethan cleaned Ranger's muzzle with rain, and scratched under the jaw until the dog sighed. We're not heroes, he said almost to himself. We're witnesses. Sometimes that's heavier, Reed replied. Get clear. Ethan shut the handset down, tucked it into a small cache he'd prepared, and wedged it beneath a root where a legal hand could find it if he didn't. Dawn rubbed pewter along the ridge. They moved east, bodies sore, minds steady, steps quickening as light gathered behind the tree. Ranger kept pace, eyes bright, ready. Behind them the mine cooled. Ahead lay a porch that might never feel safe again, a town that would learn names on the evening news, and a justice that would take its time but could not pretend it hadn't been called. Together they slipped into timber older than memory, dog close, man silent, both carrying truth no blast could erase.